Um, I have a new friend that wanted to say hello for this video. So this is Evie. She is like the mascot of my apartment. Anyway, so she's just saying hello. Sal is also saying hello as well. Today, Monday, is technically a PD day, so professional development day for staff and teachers and myself. So like, if we were still in school, this would be considered a no school day. So like, you do not technically have to do anything today if you don't want to, but if you're the kind of person that likes spacing out your work with watching videos and doing your reading guides, I figured I'd record this today and try to get it up today in case you wanted to do that. But if you want to be, I don't know, kind of take this as another, day off of school, that's up to you. And I'm sure you received an email about this, or your parents received an email about this, that the district has officially decided to do credit, no credit for the grades for this semester, which is going to be no surprise. Did I say this already? I think I said this already, didn't I? Because I recorded something on Friday. Okay, never mind. Sorry. I can't remember which class I've already said this to in a recording. Okay, anyway, moving on. You already know about that. Is anything else I was supposed to say? Oh yeah, yesterday my husband and I, we did takeout from pizza takeout from this food place across the street from us for it's the first time we've done food from an outside source in I think since Valentine's Day, just because we've just been staying in a lot. But it was so good. I got breadsticks, garlic breadsticks. It was amazing. Yeah, I really miss breakfast, going out to eat for brunch or something like that, because breakfast is one of my favorite foods of the day, meals of the day. So I really miss brunch. So this pizza was kind of a next best thing, I guess. Okay, so moving on to what this video is actually about. Today we're doing community ecology. So a community is going to be the living organisms inside an environment. So an ecosystem was your biotic plus abiotic factors, whereas a community is going to be just your biotic factors. And so it's usually describing, different species that are living together in a community. And so the thing that we really focus on are how do those different species interact with each other, negative and positive ways for those species. And so what we're going to be talking about today in this chapter is the different interactions that species can have with each other when they live in the same community, and also the factors that are going to be affecting the diversity of a community in a particular environment. Okay, so symbiosis just means that symbiosis describes when two species live, near each other, in close proximity to each other. Usually, usually symbiosis only includes commensalism, parasitism, and mutualism. But I mean, some people will include competition and something like that into the definition for symbiosis. But anyway, these are the 5 interactions that we're going to be talking about: predation, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and competition. And these interactions between species, they're you'll see in your reading guide, it's kind of denoted with some combination of a plus sign, a minus sign, and maybe a 0. And that's to show this interaction, does it benefit one species and then hurt the other species, or does it benefit both species, or whatever. Okay, so this is an example of predation. Predation is going to hurt one species, obviously, and then benefit the other species, because the predator gets to eat when the prey dies. So on the left you have a picture of a snake that is eating a frog, I think, and then on the right you got a lioness that has just attacked a buffalo. bison, buffalo thing, a grazing animal. So the thing about predation is that, well, if, let's say, in this example, the hare and the lynx, if the lynx starts, eating all the hare, and so then the hare population clearly starts decreasing. If the hare population goes too low, then there's not enough food left to continue supporting the population of the lynx. So the lynx population is going to be following the prey population. So they kind of travel together and, spiking up and down and up and down. And it's the prey that really has the power to control the population of the lynx, which is its predator, because if there's no food, the lynx can't survive. And sometimes you run into a problem if that prey that a predator is feeding on happens to be something called a keystone predator, because let's say in the example of the lynx and the hare, the lynx may be a predator for the hare, but the hare may also be a predator for something else. And in the instance where some animal is hunting a keystone species or a keystone predator, that can actually be quite detrimental to a community, to the ecosystem. But we're going to get into that a little more when we talk about factors that are affecting the diversity of a community. So, clearly the predator has certain traits that kind of help it do its job of killing its prey, whether that be like snakes have venom to kind of attack their prey, or, some animals are, the cheetah is is the fastest animal out there. So, but prey also, they have adapted some specific features that kind of help them do their thing of staying alive. So in the case of prey, sometimes they use color, like the shade of their skin, to help them stay alive. So you have some prey are gonna camouflage into their environment, but then some prey really do the opposite of camouflaging, like this blue frog here, and this is called aposematic coloration. And basically the idea is that their brightness is kind of like, I don't know, like when you're driving and you see the flashing lights, and it kind of signals you to be on alert, oh, hey, something's happening, or slow down, or whatever. So it's kind of like a warning to other predators that hey, I'm stay away from me, I could be bad for you. And somehow it's just kind of developed that predators are a little cautious of very brightly colored organisms. So that would be aposematic coloration. So instead of hiding, they're kind of displaying a warning to everyone around them. There's also mimicry. Oh, here, this toad is an example of a coloration that's camouflage. Okay, so with mimicry, you have two kinds. There's Batesian mimicry. In Batesian mimicry, one organism is mimicking a harmful organism, and the organism that's doing the mimicking is a fraud. So, in this example, you have the larva of a hawk moth. It's kind of going to do this thing where it kind of mimics a snake, a dangerous snake, and then predators kind of just stay away because they think it's that snake. But the hawk moth larva actually poses no threat. It's definitely not dangerous in any way, shape, or form. It's just pretending. And then in Mullerian mimicry, both of the organisms that kind of look similar are actually harmful, and they're kind of banding together in kind of forming a mob. So then predators kind of start to learn oh, yellow and black stripes is bad sign. Stay away from anything that's black and yellow striped. And so then harmful animals, they're kind of expanding their own coloration to just kind of collectively means something like even more dangerous. So that's why like a lot of, bees, wasps, yellow jackets, they're all kind of like, they don't look exactly the same, but it's kind of like the same concept of like yellow and black stripes. Okay. So the next interaction we're going to talk about is mutualism. Mutualism means that both organisms are helping each other. So each organism has something that the other organism wants. So in the case of, an alarm on my phone is going off. So like pollinators, are a really good example of mutualism, where the pollinator is getting pollen from the flower, and in the process, the flower is being helped because the pollen kind of gets passed around from flower to flower, and it kind of helps to spread its pollen. Other example of mutualism would be like ants on a tree, on a certain kind of tree, that the tree kind of helps to give some shelter to the ants and feed the ants, but then the ants also kind of protect the tree from, like, I don't know, invading any invaders or something like that. So mutualism is like a win-win situation. Gosh, this interaction always like creeps me out. Parasitism, it's like predation with a predator and prey, except the predator is the predator, which in this case is a parasite, is like living with or inside its host. So instead of predator and prey, it's parasite and host. And usually it's usually not in the best interest for the parasite to kill the host, because the whole idea is that the parasite is feeding off of the host and is kind of mooching and getting the nutrients that the host would be getting, but the parasite is stealing it instead. So obviously if the host died, then the parasite stops getting its food and has to find like a new host. But there are some parasites that kill their host because they, it somehow benefits them. There's two types of parasitism: endo versus ecto, which is basically inside versus outside. Inside parasite would be this poor fish here. Worms tend to be so gross. I hate thinking about it. Worms tend to be, pretty common parasite, endoparasite. But then there are some parasites that kind of live on the outside of an organism, like this fish here on the right has a parasite that's kind of just, glomming on between its eyes, and it just sort of, feeds on the body tissues. So, yeah, okay, let's move on from that. Commensalism is when one species is benefiting, but the other species is neither hurt nor harmed. So it's kind of just like whatever, and only one species is being helped. The really common example is the clownfish and the sea anemone, where the clownfish is given a home and the sea anemone and some protection, but the sea anemone is kind of thought to not really be affected in any way, neither hurt nor harmed. Commensalism is actually very difficult to find because there's always postulations that maybe that species presence does, add some factor that's positive or negative, and so it maybe slightly helps or slightly harms the organism that's thought to have no effect. In the case of the anemone and the clownfish, some researchers think that maybe the clownfish helps to circulate water through the anemone by swimming around or fanning its fins and whatnot, and that helps to have better circulation, which helps the anemone grow better or something. So commensalism in its true form is really actually hard to find in nature. But yep, that's commensalism. Oops. And the last one we're going to talk about is competition. Competition is two species are competing for the same resource: food, water, land, a mate. Competition can happen intraspecifically, which is within a species. So in this case, you got two vultures, same species, they're fighting for I'm going to assume it's a dead carcass of some sort. But if it's interspecific competition between two different species, two results can happen. So the competitive exclusion principle is stating that if you have two different species and they need the same thing, then they need the same limiting resource. They can't live in the same area. One species is just going to get to the resource faster and use it faster, more efficiently, reproduce faster, and then that species is just going to take over and like kind of crowd out the other species into extinction for that area. The other thing that can happen for competition is resource partitioning. And so resource partitioning is when two, similar species that they would normally need the same resources, they're gonna peacefully exist by kind of adapting so that they maybe won't use the exact same resources. They'll kind of like split it. So it's kind of like a peaceful cohabitation. And so what ends up happening is that these species that have resource partitions, they end up having different niches. And a niche is basically like the role that this organism plays in the ecosystem. So, and like, it's kind of like the job that the organism plays. And the niche is, it is composed of like the different, like what are the different environment factors that the species can tolerate. Like maybe they tolerate a specific temperature the best, or they eat a certain food, or whatever it is. They live in a certain place. That's all part of the organism's niche because it's how they function in the ecosystem. Now, especially with resource partitioning, you see a difference between the fundamental niche, which is it's kind of like the full potential that a organism could inhabit. Like this is everywhere they could live in that ecosystem. But when you have resource partitioning, what tends to happen is that an organism will just occupy its realized niche, which is like in the case of this picture with you have I forgot the actual name, mussels, and so let's see, for the brown one, its fundamental niche is like the entire rock coast, the rocky part, whether it's in the water or out of the water. But it ends up really only occupying this higher part of the rock that's out of the water, and that's because the blue mussel, its fundamental niche, like it can't really handle being out of the water too much, otherwise it dries out, and so it has to like be in this lower area of the rock, otherwise it's not going to survive. So for the blue one, its fundamental niche ends up being kind of similar to the realized niche, where it actually ends up occupying. But for the brown one, its realized niche is actually quite smaller than where it could be inhabiting. And then, like, furthermore, when you have like a really complex food web, and like different organisms can either feed on different prey, or they are prey to various organisms higher up the food chain. This allows this like really strong diversity. It helps the community to be more resilient, so that if there's any competition happening or whatnot, like it's not going to be disrupting the entire food web that strongly. And it creates a lot of different like pathways so that different organisms can still get their food through a variety of different ways. Okay, so we're going to start talking about the factors that influence diversity in a community. So there are some species in the community that they have more influence over the other species populations in the community. So we're going to talk about two two main kinds of species. The first is called a dominant species, and that is just the most abundant species out there. So the highest amount of biomass. And they are important because when there's so much of them in the ecosystem environment, they will affect, first of all, like the kind of the shape of the land. They have a strong influence on the abiotic factors of that ecosystem, like what does the soil look like, what's the layout of the ground, or is there shade? In the case of a tree, like if a tree was if a certain kind of tree was the most dominant species in a certain ecosystem, that tree species is going to be affecting the soil type, soil quality, whether or not there's shade, and then if the soil stays wet, or the nutrients in the soil and stuff like that. And those abiotic factors are going to affect what kind of other species can live there. So the dominant species definitely has a really big impact on the community just by its sheer volume of numbers. Species that are part of like connected to a lot of different other species in a food web, so like they're part of many different chains. They're also important because they're just so interconnected to all these different chains inside one food web for the community that anything happening to their population can affect a lot of different places at the same time. And then a keystone species, which we'll go into further examples a few slides later. A keystone species is a particular species that's not the most abundant, but because of the nature of its niche, like how it functions in the ecosystem and how it interacts with the ecosystem, they have a really strong effect on the biodiversity of the community and on the population of other species. So they're usually not the most abundant, they're not the dominant species, but what they lack in number, they make up for in just like the unique positioning of their role and their like control over they're kind of like a cornerstone of the community. Okay, so biodiversity in a community is a measure of both species richness and species abundance. So species richness is going to be like the number of different species that you have in the community, whereas relative abundance is kind of like what are the proportions or the percentages of those different species. So in this picture, in both communities 1 and 2, the species richness is the same. There's four types of trees, but the relative abundance changes from community 1 to community 2. And just by looking at it, with your eye visually, you don't even need to see the numbers. You know that community 1 just looks more diverse, because community 2, you see so much of the same tree, like for most of the forest, that it just doesn't look too diverse. It looks like it's mostly just one tree. And so for high biodiversity, you need both a lot of different species richness, but you also need kind of relatively equal relative abundances. So you have, so it's not like just one species is pretty much dominating the whole land. You should remember from last chapter that, or maybe, I don't know, some lecture ago, that biodiversity is dependent on light and water, especially in land biomes, that will really affect the amount of biodiversity that can be there. The other factor that we didn't mention, or is new that we're mentioning, but it should make sense, is the size of the community's area is also going to affect the amount of biodiversity. So the idea is that the bigger the area, the more diverse the community is, because there's more space to allow more species to inhabit. Whereas if you have a very small space, you can only have like so many different species living there, and it's much easier for one species to kind of just take over the whole area. So As area increases, species diversity increases, or biodiversity increases. And then with the top picture, evapotranspiration is kind of the official term for the measure of, how much water is in that biome. So evapotranspiration is water that's evaporating from the leaves of plants and trees. So as you have more evapotranspiration, you have more richness of species. So that's why the rainforest, with the greatest measure of evapotranspiration, has the most biodiversity. Okay, so we're back to keystone species. So as I said, keystone species, they're important because just due to their role in the community, any change in their population has a dramatic effect on the rest of the community and the biodiversity of that community and the populations of many other species in that community. So I'm going to do 2 examples. We'll start with the left. The sea star, Pisaster is the sea star. I really love that. That's its name. So the sea star, and it lives on the coast, and it feeds on mussels. So normally, sea star is there, it's eating the mussels, and everything's fine. And like this black line here on the graph shows that there's about somewhere between 17 and 20 number of species, different species present in this one, coastal environment. But if you remove the sea star, so without Pisaster, you get this disaster where the mussels that it was eating, the mussels that the sea star eats is a dominant species. So without its natural predator there, the mussel will just completely take over the environment, and then it crowded out all the other species that would have been there. So then it was just dominated by one species. So then you can see the red line is the species diversity just shot down and was pretty low, less than 5 different species. So that's kind of an example of like how the sea star is a keystone species, because without it, then like the whole community kind of goes into like this disaster. The second example is with the sea otter. So the sea otter is the natural predator of the sea urchin, and the sea urchin is the natural predator of kelp. And so normally the sea otters are going to kind of keep the sea urchin population in check, and so then the kelp population can be healthy and robust. But then you had killer whales starting to eat the sea otters, and then the sea otters population started going down, and then the sea urchin population started exploding, and then the kelp started disappearing. So that's enough. So like the sea otter is the keystone species of this community, and without it, then like you're losing the kelp, and then without the kelp, no other organism is going to survive, because your producers are the foundation of your food web. So that's like another example of how removing a keystone species has like a dramatic impact on the diversity of the community. Okay, so now we're going to talk about 2.5 ways that humans can affect, usually negatively, affect the diversity of a community. So, introducing non-native species. This shopping cart has zebra mussels all over it. Zebra mussels are an invasive species to like the Great Lakes and other kind of freshwater areas in America. They are originally from Russia, I think. I think Russia and some other place, I can't remember. And I think with zebra mussels, they kind of accidentally came across the sea because they were attached to like the hull of a boat or a ship or whatever, a ship that was crossing to America, and then that's how they ended up here. And they just kind of, oh gosh, I don't know where this siren is. Okay, sorry. Okay, it's gone. Okay, and then zebra mussels, oh gosh. Okay, it's driving away. Down my street, but driving away. what was I saying? Zebra mussels. So an invasive species. The thing about an invasive species and why they're really dangerous is that if they're taken away from their native environment, they might be put in an environment where they no longer have predators, and then that's really dangerous because then their population just continues to grow unchecked. Oh my gosh, there's more fire truck. Is fire truck coming? I don't know. Maybe I'll just mute this temporarily. Okay. All right, that's over. Hopefully. Invasive species, because they don't have natural predators, their population can go unchecked, and then they kind of drive out the species that are supposed to be, where the actual native species that are, in the Great Lakes or whatever, they get crowded out by the invasive species. Other example of invasive species, the kudzu plant was originally from Southeast Asia, and then they brought it to the southeast, Southeast United States. So think, Georgia or something, and they wanted to use it as, porch decoration, but it had no native predators, and the climate was really mild. There weren't any harsh winters, so this plant just grew like crazy, and it became known as the plant that ate the South. And lastly, you should be familiar with this one, the ice plant. Okay, sorry, that was a picture of the kudzu. Ice plants. I used to see them everywhere. Like when I would walk my dog in Foster City. They're like everywhere in all the parks around the water of Foster City. Ice plants are originally from South Africa, and then they were brought here somehow. And then they spread really quickly, they grow really quickly, and they change the soil of wherever they're growing, and then you don't get your native coastal plants. So you probably have seen an invasive plant in your walks around the neighborhood. And yeah, that's just one of the ways humans, sometimes accidentally or without knowing, have just kind of negatively affected the biodiversity of a community. The other ways that humans can negatively impact a community is when we start to pollute waters, and toxins get released into the water system, and then they just kind of magnify up the food chain because the toxin is going to become more and more concentrated, and as let's say your producers are going to somehow absorb some of the toxins, and then those producers get eaten by, zooplankton in this example, and then the zooplankton get eaten by fish, and then the fish get eaten by more fish, and then those large fish get eaten by birds. But because the toxin isn't dissolving or leaving the organism, it's sort of just accumulating and to higher and higher and higher concentrations. And then we're eating those fish, and so that's why my mom now is kind of nervous about eating fish because of toxins and stuff in the fish. I know, when I'm pretty sure I've heard that when pregnant women normally stay away from eating fish just because of the risk of toxins or mercury kind of accumulating in the fish that could be detrimental to the baby growing inside. So yeah, those are two ways that we as humans have kind of knowingly or unknowingly negatively impacted communities. I did say 2.5 earlier, and this is the half now because we're not always responsible. I mean, disturbances normally happen even without our interference, but humans can interfere by causing more disturbances or greater disturbances than would normally be happening. So disturbances, they're not a bad thing, like fires and floods and maybe volcanoes erupting. They're natural things that happen, and they're good for the ecosystem because it's kind of like it's kind of like the ecosystem's way of doing a detox or just a reset. It kind of just resets everything, and then organisms that weren't there originally, they now have a chance to habitate that area. So this would always be happening. Natural disturbances would always be happening, and that's fine, because it's good to be like allowing new colonizations of different species every now and then. Yeah, and this allows the community to change and to be like developing and adapting over time, so that they just continue becoming like more diverse and more robust. After a disturbance, so like fire or glacier sliding away or something like that, you have what's called succession, and it's just the process of like you have one pioneer species that's going to start out growing in the newly disturbed area, and then that species gets replaced by another species, which gets replaced by another species. So all that replacing is called succession. Works pretty similarly to how the king or queen of England is continually succeeded by the next in line. And so that the plants that are kind of dominating the area that was just disturbed, it will continue changing in like this sequence, so the diversity just keeps changing and growing. So we're going to talk about two types of succession. There's primary and secondary succession. Secondary succession is the one I'll talk about first. It is the one that you're probably most familiar with in terms of like a fire happens. We go back to like this picture with the fire, and then like everything got burned and whatnot. These two pictures are actually an example of secondary succession. Secondary succession happens on a very quick scale. So the picture on the right with the purple flowers, that's actually like just a year later after the fire. So secondary succession happens pretty quickly because the fire may have destroyed all the plants, but it didn't destroy the soil. It's just like soil is still there. And so then, you have your first species come in, and then it eventually gets replaced by trees and whatnot, and the forest kind of pretty much comes back to looking exactly like it used to a year or so later. Primary succession would be like a volcano formed a new island, or a glacier has slid away and left a moraine. So primary succession means like there is no soil. You're starting with zero. There's just bare rock. And so you have to like develop a soil, develop organic compounds and nutrients and whatnot, and then you slowly have your first pioneer species come in, and then they get slowly replaced by other species, and you're building a soil and everything, and then finally, many, many, many years later, you start to get trees. Primary succession takes a long time to take place, and the final environment can look a lot different than it used to be, just because you literally started from like all the way back to zero, and so you have the greatest chance to have like a completely new set of species kind of take over that area. So we're going to go over an example. This is an example of primary succession in Alaska, Glacier Bay. And so we're going to talk about the succession that happened at a moraine. A moraine is kind of the area that's left behind when a glacier basically runs away. So there's nothing there except just rock, cold rock, no soil or anything. So we're going to start at the upper, like picture A. The first thing that happens is you have your pioneer stage. You have your pioneer plants coming in. So at this point, it's like very hardy plants, like mosses, fireweed, and stuff like that. And then like a few decades later, you're gonna have this plant called, and I'm only being this specific with the plants because this is like specifically what happens at this place in Alaska, Glacier Bay. And then you have, after a few decades of your pioneer plants, you have this shrubby plant called dryas that starts to take over, and it forms kind of a mat over the land, and it will dominate the area. And then another few decades pass, and then you get you get these alder trees that are starting to like take over the area, and then those alder trees get replaced by spruce trees, and then like a century later, no joke, you might get, you know, a forest again. So as you can see, like the time scale for primary succession is a lot longer than secondary succession, just because it takes a lot of time to like be building up the soil again, be building up those abiotic reservoirs for to hold nutrients and whatnot, and you have to wait for rock to be weathering so that you can get nutrients into the soil that's building. So it just takes a really long time. And this chart on the bottom left is kind of showing the amount of nitrogen in the soil, and so you can see it's really, really low because there wasn't soil. And so it slowly starts building up with each succession of species during this primary succession, and maybe about when the alder comes in, that's when the nitrogen content in the soil really starts shooting up. But at the beginning, it's really low. Yeah, so disturbances that cause succession. It's like another way that to kind of like affect the diversity in a community, and sometimes humans make that worse than what it normally would be. So for this chapter, we talked about different interactions between species in a community, and then the ways that the diversity of a community can be affected in different ways. That's it for this chapter. It's not an hour yet, which is always a good sign. Like I said, you don't have to do this chapter today if you don't want to. You can do it tomorrow if you want. I just know that personally, I like spacing out my work and not doing things back to back. But yeah, we'll do a Zoom hangout tomorrow, and then we can talk about more stuff. I think that's all I have to say to you. So I hope you have a nice day. I hope you're finding something interesting to do or something new to learn, and staying safe. I hope all your family's staying safe too. Okay, see you tomorrow.